Hi guys, my name is Sergey Morenets and I would like to welcome all our participants of webinar Spring Beans Evolution. So a few words about myself. I am Java developer, trainer, speaker, and also writer of programming books. Also, I am one of the founder of programming site IT Simulator and trainer in programming courses IT Discovery. I am also speaker at Java conferences in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, but this year most conferences are online, but 2 years ago I was speaker at one of the biggest Java conferences, Drawbacks in Krakow. First of all, I would like to check how is sound. Is it okay for everyone? And I would like to congratulate all the Java developers because today is the official date of Java 15 release. It's a great new feature, a lot of content like sealed classes and hidden classes and text blocks and other features. So I encourage you to start working with this new release. So what is this talk about? Spring Framework is the most popular Java technology. Why is that? Because it was based on dependency injection concept or IOC. It integrates with most popular frameworks with web technologies, data access technologies, or microservice technologies. So if you want to integration, if you want stable, mature GI container, then Spring Framework is your choice. Today, our talk will be interactively, so sometimes I will ask my questions and you can answer my questions in YouTube chat or, for example, in Slack chat. So what is the main purpose of Spring Framework? Spring Framework is container and it manages lifecycle of Java objects called managed objects or now simply beans, Spring Beans. These managed beans are created by Spring Framework, wired, initialized, and destroyed. And we use different configuration types to describe these Spring Beans, either XML, Groovy files, annotations, or Java Kotlin-based configurations. So our beans has the following life cycle from creation, initialization, wiring, auto-wiring, and destroyal. What are the main components in this life cycle? So the main players here is interface bean factory that is responsible for handling beans. Its descendant is application context. So this is a first entry point for programmers when they want to access beans in Spring application. Application context uses another abstraction called bean definition reader that actually loads Spring Beans from different configurations. It can be XML, Groovy, or for example, Java-based annotations, functional registration, and others. So it uses class path scanning, and it's a bit different. After Spring detected all the bean candidates, it uses another component called bean definition registry to store beans. Each bean stores as a bean definition instance. That was the basic schema for Spring for almost 15 or 16 years. And today we will talk how Spring Beans have evolved for such big period of time. So let's start with XML configuration. Spring Framework appeared in 2002, and XML was the only possible configuration type. It was very simple and relied on the XML schemas. So you have to write one or many XML files and describe your Spring Beans, where you should specify at least two attributes: its ID, bean ID is unique per context, and also class. And Spring uses reflection to initialize this bean and also auto-wire it. Then you had to pick up some application context implementation, for example, class path XML application context, specify the XML file location, and load this configuration. So you see that it was very simple. It requires only XML parser to parse this XML file and then load Spring Beans. But it was also his main disadvantage, because you had to explicitly write all the beans, all the classes, and also relation between them. For example, if you have relation between beans, you had to explicitly specify the type of relation or injection, constructor, field, method, and this configuration was rather boilerplate. And now, this year, there is a new feature request to provide a flag to disable XML support. So XML support will not be deleted, but it is intended to be partially deprecated because it's not so much used now. Why is that? Why we need to disable XML support? We will talk about it later, that there is a new trend called GraalVM native image. So Spring engineers want to minimize the memory consumption and startup time. So they just want to remove or deprecate feature that are not actively used today. And this feature request is aimed at the future Spring release 5.3 that will be shipped at the end of October. Next configuration type is annotation configuration. In this configuration type, you don't need to write any specific configuration files, but only thing you need to do is to put annotation component, service, controller, or repository on your Spring class, and after that, Spring will detect these bin candidates and register it. Very simple rule, the short class name will be bin identifier. Spring even is smart enough to detect the inner classes. So if you have an inner class in your Spring component and you put component annotation, Spring will also find it, detect, and register a Spring bin. Now, if you want to load such configuration, you need to use another application context implementation called Annotation-config application context and specify package or package so that Spring will search the class path and find all the Spring beans in this package. But how Spring does that? If Spring uses reflection, it should load all the classes in all the jars and search for annotations. And it will be very slow. So Spring uses a very interesting technology library called SM. SM is bytecode modification library, so it allows you to view the application bytecode without using Java utilities and facilities. And Spring uses a very interesting approach here. It doesn't use SM as a dependency, like Maven dependency, but it repackage and patch SM in his distributive. Why is that? Because SM can be changed very often, and Spring just wants to add more stability in his code. Currently it uses SM7, but there is also feature request to upgrade to SM9. Java records. I think you know that in Java 14 there was a new feature called records. What is the difference between a record and simple class? First of all the fields are final and private in such type. All the fields have getters and all args constructor, also equals and hash code, all the fields, and this is preview feature, so it's not production ready. And how do you think if we try to put component on this record type and specify this package in our configuration and application context, will Spring detect it? Try to answer this question in our chat. Well, the first answer, it should be, because Spring always claims to support the most recent version of Java and most recent features. However, if you try to do that now, you will see this very interesting exception. So Spring supports Java 14, but SM7 not. So it requires SM9, and this SM version will be available only in Spring 5.3. So we will wait till October. And there is issue and ticket at Spring GitHub repository to add support for Java records and SM9. Bean scopes. Every bean has attribute or characteristic called scope. So there is a 6 scope default scopes, but you can add your own scopes. The most important scopes are prototype and singleton. Yes, and if you pass some Java interviews, technical interviews, you may be asked about what is the difference between prototype and singleton. And the key difference is that prototype is thread safe because you create a new instance per each access, and singleton is not safe because there is a singleton instance, and if you have some shared data, you need some kind of synchronization. Also, all the singleton beans are created eagerly. So after you finish refreshing the application context, you have a fully initialized instance, and prototype beans are created on demand, only first usage. So you see that annotation configuration is much more suitable than XML, but it also has a lot of drawbacks. First of all, it's not possible to define two beans of the same class. It's not possible to define a bean if the type is not available at runtime. Not possible to define a bean if you don't have access to the sources of this class, for example, if it's JDK sources. And not possible to exclude dynamically some bean from Spring context. How can we resolve this? The first approach is so-called FactoryBean. For example, there is a Java class called local datetime, and you can try to declare it as a Spring bean, for example, a prototype scope to get new local datetime each time you access it. But it's not possible using component because the constructor is private and it requires 2 parameters. So what should you do? You can use the FactoryBean's interface, and if you create an implementation with this interface and override getObject and getObjectType methods, you can provide how Spring should instantiate this bean and what is the class of this bean. If you need to use the prototype scope, you should return false in the isSingleton function. And now you can auto-wire the property of this type, local datetime, and it will be managed by Spring now. Very useful. In Spring 3, there was a new configuration type called Java-based configuration. So now you have a special annotation called configuration, and you can declare your Spring beans using a new approach. You should declare a new method and put annotation bean on it. And Spring will search all the configuration classes, find all the methods with bean annotation, and declare it as a Spring beans. What is the advantage of this approach? Well, first of all, you don't need to modify your source code, your beans, your classes. Yes, you put annotation only on configuration classes. That's much better. You can logically group your Spring beans in the different configurations, and it allows you more smoothly manage them. You can auto-wire automatically your dependencies and put them into your bean methods. However, it has some non-trivial features. For example, by default, if you use Java-based configuration, that all the configuration classes are subclassed using cglib. And then, if you call, for example, the server method in this appconfig class, then only one instance of server will be created, not 3. Why is that? because Spring will create a proxy around server method and it will cache the server instance after first instantiation. If you don't want this functionality and you don't want to use CGLib proxies, you can just add attribute proxy bin methods, set it to false, and then this feature will be not used. Another advantage of Java-based configuration is that you can programmatically initialize your bin instance. It was not possible with component annotation. You can just add some code that will initialize your bin. How to initialize our application context? Now you should specify the root or base application config class, and then Spring will detect all the bin methods and load this configuration. Or you can combine, you can add a package and then register all the necessary configuration classes. Another advantage of configurations is that you can add an inner static classes in your configuration class and declare new bin methods. You don't even need to put configuration annotation on this inner class. So you can also group your Spring Beans by some logical concept. You can even add a new Spring Bean component in your configuration class, and Spring will also detect it, this use case, and also register this console writer bin. What are the drawbacks of Java-based configuration? First of all, if your Spring Bean has a constructor and a lot of dependencies, for example 4 or 5 or maybe even greater, then you have to auto-wire all these dependencies in this bin method and supply in this constructor. It's a bit not useful and not suitable, but we have to follow this approach. Another drawback, if you have a configuration class, for example app-config, and declare the bin book service, and then occasionally you have another configuration class, for example service config, and you have declared the same book service bin, then in Spring framework, in pure Spring framework, no error will be thrown and one of the bins will be silently ignored. It's very, very strange behavior for Spring. So it doesn't throw an error, it just hides the error. And in Spring Boot, you will see the error. It will be complained that you have two bins of the same time. So you see that behavior in Spring and Spring Boot is different. It's also very, very unusual because usually Spring and Spring Boot has similar functionality. Spring Boot appeared in 2016 and it added another bin type. Before that, if you need to initialize properties in your bins, you can use either annotation value and supply the expression to initialize it, or you can use an abstraction API called environment and also specify what is the property name in the properties file, in environment, system properties, to initialize your fields. However, it was not very suitable because if you use value annotation, you have to add a lot of fields only to initialize them via reflection. If you use environment, it also was some kind of boilerplate. So in Spring Boot, you have a new bin type called configuration properties type. If you put an annotation, configuration properties, and specify the base prefix in this annotation, and in your properties file or in your environment, you add the properties where the base prefix is app user and the suffix the same as the field names in user info class, then if you add an annotation enable configuration properties and add the user info class as an attribute, then Spring will detect such configuration and automatically loads it. So you see that you don't need to add component annotation or Java-based configuration. It will just be loaded without that. And you can now auto-write this user info in any of your Spring beans. Spring Framework 5. Let's review what are the features in Spring Framework 5 that is related to Spring beans. But before that, let's talk about this small poll created by Phil Webb. Phil Webb is one of the Spring architects, and in this poll, he asks his audience, what would you like to complain about? Too much magic or too much boilerplate? Why people will complain about magic? And what is magic? The magic is something that is not readable or clear or concise. For example, in Spring there is an annotation lazy, async, scheduled, some kind of proxies. In Spring Boot is auto configuration rules and so on. So people not always like this kind of magic. And in Spring 5 there was an attempt to move to another approach. So Spring 5 was released 3 years ago, and it has a lot of features like Web Flux framework. There was a JDK 8 base, added support for Unit 5, and it has 3 main goals. First goal is major support for Kotlin and its features. Secondly is migration to functional programming style, functional approach. And third goal is to add support for GraalVM and GraalVM native image. So this support was declared to be released as Spring 5.3 and Spring Boot 2.4, so we will wait for these releases. Maybe you know that functional or programmatic bean registration was available in Spring from the beginning. So if you have reference to application context and you have fully initialized instance of your class object, you can just use register singleton function to register it as a Spring bean. Their drawback is that was a special bean because it doesn't work any kind of auto-wiring or kind of injection, initializing. It was only registered as a Spring bean. What changed in Spring 5 and what is functional bean registration? Now, if you have access to annotation config application context, you can just pass a class name to function register bean, and Spring will register this bean as a new candidate. So this is similar to component annotation, but component is declarative approach, and this is the imperative or functional approach. 2 minor notes. First one is that the bean ID will be not employee, as you may think, but org.employee. So it's a full package name. And second note is that this function, register bean, will initialize and register this bean, but it doesn't return it. It would be great if it returned this bean to manage it or maybe use it later. It just return void. What if you need to construct your bean, like in your Java-based configuration? It's possible. So in this function, register bean, you need to pass not only the class name, but also the lambda that will initialize this bean. So this is similar to .bean annotation. If you need to add more attributes to your bean, for example, set the primary status or lazy status or change the default scope, there is also function that uses the interface bean definition customizer, and you can supply all the necessary attributes, like you can do with annotation primary, lazy, or scope. How can you do in Spring Boot? In Spring Boot, you don't have reference to annotation config application context. But in Spring Boot, you have another abstraction called application context initializer. So if you create your own class that will implement this interface application context initializer and override initialize function, that in this function you have parameter called generic application context, and you can also register your beans supply the bin names if it's possible or bin classes. And you see that in this case you can manage, you can control the bin ordering. In Java annotation configuration there was some special annotation or special methods. Now you can control the bin ordering programmatically. How to specify these initializers in your application? There are two approaches. Firstly, you can initialize them in the special class Spring Application Builder. Usually in Spring Boot we use the class called Spring Application. But if you need to customize Spring Boot, there is a builder style Spring Application Builder, and you can just call method initializers and supply your application context initializers. Or another approach, there is a special file called Spring Factories, and you should put all your application context initializers, and when Spring Boot will be starting, it will be loading this file, find all these initializers, and load your configuration. Is it easy to migrate from Java configuration to functional configuration? For example, we have a bin DB writer, and this bin requires a property that you access from your environment. How can you migrate this code to functional approach? It's very simple, because generic application context has reference to environment, and environment it's possible to use function getProperty to find this property name. And the function register_bin accepts multiple parameters, including all the constructor arguments for your bins. What if you need to register a bin that has some kind of constructor injection? For example, we have a server bin that has dependency writer. How do you think? Is it possible to initialize your bin this way? So we register bin memory writer, and then we register another bin server, and uses application context getBin function to retrieve writer instance. How do you think? Will it work? If you try to run this code, you will see an exception. Why is that? Because when this code is executing, then context is not initialized, and you cannot access and retrieve bins from application context. So what can you do? You can try to register bin, refresh it to load all the application context, and then try to register another bin. How do you think? Will it work? Unfortunately, no. Why is that? Because to refresh context, to load context, you need to start all the necessary Spring Boot bins. And since you don't do that, the Spring Boot application failed to start. So how can you register this server bin? It's very simple. You just need to put initialization of server into lambda, and the server will be initialized when context will be loaded. That will work. So what is GraalVM and GraalVM native image? It's an attempt to transform Java bytecode into native code during building. Why it's popular now? Why it's trend? Because I think you know that one of the most popular technologies are microservices, and microservices using containers, Docker containers. And for these containers, the main idea is to minimize the image size, the memory consumption, and image start type time. So, for example, if you convert your Spring Boot application into GraalVM native image, then its start type time will be around 50 milliseconds. Not even seconds, 50 milliseconds. So this native image will contain special components like memory management, thread management or scheduling, and it will contain all your application classes, dependencies, JDK classes, like your usual Java application. But when this image will be built, it will analyze which classes are not used, and it will be just dropped from this image. Is it easily to use GraalVM for Spring and Spring Boot applications. Not always, because some features are supported, like GNI or unsafe memory access. Some features like JDK proxies, reflection, resources are supported with configuration. So you need to supply special configuration files so that GraalVM will find and load them. And some features will not be supported, like cglib, dynamic class loading, and others. So Spring will have to eliminate or minimize these features to be compatible with GraalVM. And one of the attempts to do so is Spring-fu project. It's an incubator project, and its main goal to migrate from Java annotations configurations to functional style. It's split into Kofu, that contains Kotlin DSL, and JaFu, Java DSL. And Spring engineers state that it has lower memory consumptions and faster startup, about 40%. It's still in progress, so you see that its version is still 0.3. I think that this year it will not be released, but next year will be. Its main developer is Arjen Postma, and by default it disables XML support and SPL support, because it also touches their performance and behavior. So how is configuration, Spring configuration in JaFu? You see that there is no auto configuration like in Spring Boot, and there is very simple functional style registration of your beans. So you just need to supply all the beans and its installation logic. Or for example, how is properties initialized. And this is the way how we will load our Spring Boot application. So there is no annotations, you just need to supply all your beans in your code. This approach is much more simpler, more compact, and more readable. And there is another project called Spring-init. It was started the last year, and its main goal is to take your projects, Spring projects, Spring Boot projects, and convert your Java-based configuration into functional bean configuration during compilation phase, including Spring Boot auto configuration. It's also still incubator, but we'll see how it will look the next year. Okay, that's all I want to talk about, and I would like to see your questions and answer them. While I am waiting for questions, I would like to announce some new events. So in November, we will have a new online workshop. It's a free workshop. It's called Studying Spring Boot. And in this workshop, we will take existing legacy application and try to apply all the possible Spring Boot features. Yes, so from the scratch, including development, testing, and so on. Yeah, so it's a very interesting workshop. So please join it in November. And if you like our trainings, then this year we will have a training called Docker for Java developers. It's 2-day training. And in October we will have a training Persistence for Java developers. It's all about Hibernate, Spring Data, and Liquibase. It's also today, so you are welcome to join and attend it. So there was a question about workshop details. If you use our site IT Simulator, then there is an events page, and you can just see all our upcoming events, or our Facebook page as well. There was a question, is functional approach widespread in EE today? I assume that there was a question about Java EE or Jakarta EE. If I am wrong, please correct me. You know, I've never heard about it, but I think you know that there is an extension of Jakarta EE called MicroProfile, and it's evolving, it's growing very much. So who knows, maybe something like functional approach will be done there as well. I'm not an expert in Jakarta EE. I'm using Spring, so maybe not. But if you work with modern IOC technologies like Micronaut or Quarkus, then these technologies use minimal magic and try to use also functional approaches. Okay, no more questions. So thank you very much. I was glad to perform this talk for you, and see you later at our events. Thank you.